from last week. It covers 2 chapters in the book. So by way of review, the title is Gospel Identity That Reshapes Hardship and Resolves Fear. And last week we mentioned, kind of focused in a little bit on how Peter and John had kind of the gospel identity had reshaped their willingness to work together. That now, instead of being at odds with one another and fighting with one another in midst of, hey, am I going to sit at the throne? Is he going to have a place at the throne? Now they're working together. Now they're saying, silver and gold have I none. Let's go into the temple in prayer together. That their identity was now tied to the gospel, not their titles or their successes. When they were in prison, they found joy. When they were persecuted, they found brotherhood. When they were challenged, they found courage. At every difficulty, their lives grew stronger, more resilient, deeper in a grace-based identity. And we mentioned a few things. Gospel identity fights fear by giving us an undying drive and direction, an uncommon confidence and resilience, and unbreakable joy and optimism. Those are all things that we desire just as we reach towards having our identity shaped, and especially as it relates to the traditional or the modern, we're really leaning into those things, hoping to find an undying drive and direction, hoping to find uncommon confidence and resilience, hoping to find unbreakable joy and optimism. That's what we're looking for with the traditional or a modern, but they all crumble because we're looking for external, at the end of the day, there's some sort of external validation that we're looking for, when God in the gospel identity is really the one that gives it to us. He's the one that gives us the resilience. He's the one that gives us that joy and optimism. The key is they no longer lived for an identity, but from one, which is a resilient one. And then the last statement before we jump into this next section, a gospel identity doesn't merely demand that we are new and then live up to it. It declares us new and empowers us to live from the newness in authentic ways. So we can certainly rejoice in the fact that God has enabled us to have this identity through Christ, the death, burial, and resurrection. The resurrection just catapulted these guys into a confidence and just an unbreakable bond, if you would, like we mentioned, joy and optimism, because of the gospel, because of what Jesus did for them. So as we start this evening, Psalm 27:1, there in your notes, the Lord is my light and my salvation. I like that word is. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Psalm 118:6, the Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do unto me? Now, no doubt, the guys that we just got done talking about, the Peters and the Johns, they had that confidence because they watched Jesus raised from the dead. I mean, they didn't physically watch him do that, but they saw him come out of the grave in victory. He conquered death. He was and so that gave them the confidence that they needed to go forward and really, the Lord is on my side. Whom shall I fear? And when we read a story like the Apostle Paul, and we read stories like we're studying this Sunday, David, when you know God is the one you're after, when you know God is the one, Jesus is our focus, our goal, then whom shall I fear? That's a good question, right? Galatians 2:20, Apostle Paul himself we used to write this, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. And so as we launch out tonight, this section in the book is called Stand Up, and how the gospel identity resolves fear. And he starts off with a story, just a little simple illustration of how he was taking his grandkids to one of the lazy river type swimming pools. And I know our kids have had that experience. My wife and I did on our honeymoon. But it's, you know what it is. It's practically just gently moving water, or it can be very, very fast moving, but in the most common area, just gently moving water. You can have fun, you can wade, you can float, you can do whatever you want, right? So he spends some time setting it up with this young grandson in his, I think he says 4 years old. Yeah, 4 years old. And he's all decked out. He's got his swimmies on. He's ready to go. And Grandpa takes him to set him in the pool, and he is locked with fear. He latches onto Grandpa. Do not let me go. I'm fearful of this water. Little does he know that this water is really only about 2 foot deep, and the current is not even strong enough to really sweep anybody away. That's why the floating kind of just gently moves you down. But he doesn't realize that. And he is just absolutely gripped with fear. And he makes this statement: two worlds collided in this moment. Chad's fearful risk aversion and Papa's confident reality. You know, in Chad's world, the lazy river, the water moving, it represents torrents of destruction. Where in Papa's world, lazy rivers are fabulous fun. So he whispers into Chad's ear, "Hey, you're going to be okay. I've got you. Just let your feet down." And the more he tries to speak into him, he latches on with more fear and grips his little legs around Papa. And he started to try to lower him into the water, but he resists. "I'm not going to do this." He's like, ironically, and this is where he mentions there's only 2.5 feet of water. And he says his mind was racing so fast I couldn't lock his attention on the facts. Here's the statement again. His actual reality was overwhelmed by his fear-constructed view. Truth shouted down by feelings, and Papa needed to orchestrate some redefining event to overpower Chad's psyche. Perhaps God has orchestrated similar events in your life for the same reason. He's not going to like this, I thought. But I knew what needed to be done. The only thing I needed to do, I could break down Chad's fear and ground him in truth. I had to let him go for a split second. And when I did, the look on his face was heartbreaking. "Papa, how could you?" His eyes widened. He cries out. Sure, he would be swept away. It is important to note, never once was Chad vulnerable to actual danger or outside of my immediate care. But in that moment, he had no sense of my love. Then Papa did something unthinkable. He reached under the water, grabbed his free-floating ankles, and began to pull them down. This time, the terror-stricken Chad began to scream, "Help, my Papa is trying to kill me." The emotion was but a fraction of a second as Chad's 4-year-old feet quickly landed on the solid ground 6 inches below. His frantic kicking for survival halted. With my face mere inches from him, I smiled into his eyes. He paused. His confusion cleared up. "Stand up," I whispered, trying to stare tender confidence into him. His fear fled. His face softened. He half smiled and briefly looked side to side, a bit embarrassed. Then he looked back at me, released his death grip, and slowly stood with broadening confidence, and I'll never forget what he said next. "Oh." With a wide smile. That moment transformed his entire vacation. He moved from fear to fun and spent the next week playing, sliding, floating, standing on solid ground just underneath him. His new confidence transformed his psyche just as the gospel transforms ours. And this is why we look at Philippians 1:6. Being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it unto the day of Jesus Christ. Confidence is the solid ground of the gospel, and joy is the unrestrainable result of standing in it. Fear often masks reality, whether it is believing the worst about a situation or making decisions out of caution instead of faith. That's, what do they say? What's the statement out there? Trading your fear for faith. Fear drives a lot of emotional decisions. Fear drives a lot of our, in this particular concept, or this particular illustration, how many times has God really truly been trying to just show us freedom and happiness and joy and love and forgiveness and grace, and yet we just tense up in fear, and we're so looking in His eye, don't let me go in this moment, right? No, Papa, we're squeezing, latching hold on to Him. We just won't let go, right? And God is like, listen, just feet below you, just inches below you is the ground, the solid ground of the gospel. And you're just fighting it because of fear. But the gospel helps us, grounds us in the reality. He's got this. He's going to carry us through. He's going to make sure that our new reality is redeemed, that our new reality is joy, that our new reality is assurance, our new reality is significance. Here's the catch. The suffering, and I like this statement, by the way, the suffering, the struggle, that was the catalyst. It is what made Jesus' followers cognizant of their new durability. If God hadn't given them a sense of instability at the surface, they would not have experienced His stability beneath it. And isn't that really the truth? You kind of look back in our lives, and just even by just in life in generally speaking, walking through, navigating certain things of life, you remember the fear that you had when you first got there, but you took that step, whether that was your first job, whether that was the first day of preschool, whether that was the first day of college, that fear, that uncertainty, right? And many people bow out. I'm not taking this step of, I'm not going into college. I'm not going to preschool, or I'm not going. Of course, some kids don't have the choice, but they go kicking and screaming, right? The reality of it is, once you get there, right, and once the kid realizes just how fun it is to have the snack time and do the playtime with the kids, then mom comes to pick them up. They're not ready to leave. The reality is, that's what Jesus provides us with the gospel. He provides that stability, and the suffering, the hardships, the fear ends up becoming the catalyst that launches us out once we see that God in His grace and His mercy sent Jesus down to die for my sin and for your sin, and He loved us enough to pay for that full price for us. Hey, what can stop us? That's really the apostles' attitude going forward was, what's going to stop me now? And that's how they went boldly before the council. That's how they went and did the things they did. And in public, raised some sick and healed the lame and so on and so forth. Why? Because even though there was laws against preaching against Christ, they did it openly. They were not willing to back down from that, because the gospel shaped that for them. This is why David could write, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers them out of them all." Paul came to understand this light momentary affliction is just preparing me for an eternal weight beyond comparison. Consider everything that changed in Chad. He didn't work at change. He couldn't force his emotions into order. He needed a new set of definitions to organically reorder his psyche. A class on physics wouldn't have helped him. Give him a class on all the different theories of how the water's flowing this fast, and there's the ground here, and no, that wouldn't have helped him. A book on water safety or a lecture on overcoming fear would have been useless in the moment. Jesus' first followers were similarly redefined. He had instructed them often, but gospel hope sprung into reality in anxious times. He applied the gospel to their struggles, and it reordered their identities in profound distress. Paul confidently stood and declared, neither do I count my life dear. Right? I don't count my life dear to myself. So if only I may finish the course that I've received from Jesus to testify the gospel of the grace of God. The power of the gospel awakens a new identity and an moment as we learn to stand on the solid ground swirling below in our world. Jesus calls us to delight our way through life, impervious to fear and anxiety. But we are so busy kicking our feet, screaming for help, that we rarely let our feet touch the bottom. We've never discovered that we can actually stand. I mean, that's kind of the beauty in this study and the reality of the gospel, and that once you come to realize that God has given us a foundation, a solid ground to stand on. That's the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we can live in that, face any fear, face any hardship, and really, truly do it with joy. Do it with unwavering security. Why? Because that's where we get it from Him. Sometimes in grace, He forcibly grabs our ankles and plants our feet in truth. But there's another way. We can voluntarily stand in the gospel. In every anxiety, we can apply the gospel to our situation, to filter and process our experience by what we know is true rather than by what we fear or feel. This is to allow the peace of God to rule in our hearts. Colossians 3:15. In John 14, Jesus promised, "My peace I leave with you." Learning to stand in the gospel is a liberating process. It allows us to fully recognize our uniqueness or God-given dreams, and also willingly embrace our responsibility to others, as He says, as unto the Lord, in Ephesians and Colossians. A gospel identity fulfills the longings of our heart without the accompanying fragility of other identities. It's all upside and no downside. New security and acceptance in abundance frees us from our fragile selves. That's why Jesus taught the disciples, "If you abide in me, and my word abide in you, then you shall be my disciples. If the Son sets you free, you shall be free indeed." Why? Because they are, you think about the word abiding. Not too long ago, I had an opportunity to study right through this passage. Is to dwell, to inhabit, to set up. Listen, plant your stakes down in Jesus. And when that fear comes, and when that fragile situation comes, and all the hardship comes, firmly plant our stakes in Jesus. And man, there's no telling what God can do in you. Standing in a gospel identity is not a one-time event. It'd be nice if it was, right? I remember that day I stood in the gospel. Nope. It's a daily event. It's a daily decision, matter of fact. Our world may overwhelm us, but solid ground is always just beneath us. The world's going to be, it's going to be swirling, right? It's going to cause all the pain and afflictions and whatever else it's going to. But listen, the solid ground of Jesus' gospel is just below the surface. And we can trust that. The gospel undergirds us with new and permanent confidence that the Lord is on my side. I will not fear what man can do to me. That is a confidence that comes from knowing that Jesus is your Savior. So let's look at this. He talks about this new solid ground that broke out in Jerusalem. So from Peter and John, right, their narrative, their weak identities that has now been restructured, reframed under the gospel. Okay, they're the new leaders, if you would, of the church, the new church. They're They're out front. They're setting the example, setting the tone, if you will. After his resurrection, Jesus' resurrection, his followers began to operate from strength and affirmation rather than for it. Okay? We say that often. We work from that position. From the position of the fact that I have been redeemed. I've been bought with a price. I have been glorified, right, by Jesus. His death, burial, and resurrection. I'm working from that. That's why I read my Bible and have that relationship with the Lord. And that's why I, in times of fear, plant my feet on the gospel, right? Because I'm operating from that, not for it. If we're working for it, then everything around us is going to be, it's miserable. It's seemingly unreachable. It's seemingly unattainable because it's always it's structured and shaped by our definition. It's that external identity, if you would, of the gospel. But they ceased being defined by the first century structures. Their definitions were no longer anchored to religious success or failure. Now we were just listening to a thing this morning about the Apostle Paul and how the Apostle Paul he would go in, people would get saved, they'd beat him, they'd stone him, And then he'd go in, people get saved, they'd beat him, they'd stone him, and how that just messed with his mentality and emotions, and overall, really he did kind of reach a pretty heavy place. But the gospel is what kept him going, and he launched back out in, and great things were done. Why? Because it didn't matter if he was a religious success, quote unquote, or failure, quote unquote. Political victory or defeat, the definition's not anchored to that. Well, my person got elected or my person got defeated. Physical life or death. See, their identities now were anchored solely to Jesus and his radical new reality. He became so real that they were organically and systematically transformed. Now, you know what that means? When you or I become organic, or we've experienced an organic change, an organic moving, an organic, not something that's been forced. That makes a difference, and that's exactly what took place with these disciples. I chuckle at this, but he says, can you imagine the titles of an autobiography on Peter's life prior to the resurrection? It would have maybe read something like this: I'm a Galilean. I'm a fisherman. I am a friend of Jesus. I'm an associate of a king. I'm in the top 3. They say he's in the inner 3, if you would. I am a key leader. I'm a competitor. I'm a warrior. I'm a failure. I'm a coward. I'm an outcast. I'm broken. I guess I'm just a Galilean and a fisherman again. Honestly, I'm not really sure who I am. And that would have been his life. Listen, probably if you've gone through this process, or if you're going through this process, you're going to find the same type of thing. Identified by this. I'm here. This is who I am. Oh man, here's my failures. I'm an outcast. I don't even know who I am. Once we reach that point, that's when God can really do his work. And really, in unfortunate ways, that's why God has to do it. When Peter's life canvas was finally blank, he understood who Jesus was, and it comprehensively redefined him. He moved from being a weak man pretending to be strong to being strong, being a humble follower of Jesus, operating in his very real strength. At last, Jesus could activate the true script of Peter's life. Paul described it beautifully in Galatians 2:20 when he says, I am crucified with Christ. This is the loss of self. Being crucified with Christ. That's the loss of self. Therefore, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. That's the finding of a new self in Jesus. So being crucified with Christ. He's died for me. He was buried. He rose again. He paid the price. Remember what we said on Sunday? He took that for us. He absorbed that for us. Why in the world are we out there struggling and fumbling around on our own? Well, we're not grounded in the gospel. We're not taking the gospel. We're not taking the fact that Jesus was already bruised for our transgressions, wounded for our iniquities. So that's the loss of self. Yet not I, but Christ lives in me. That's the finding of a new self with Christ. I live in by faith in the Son of God. That's rooted in who Jesus is. So the loss of self, the finding of a new self, rooted in who Jesus is, who loved me and gave himself for me. That's what he has done. So, because of the gospel, a multitude of people in Jerusalem experienced that moment, similar to Shad's. First century life in the Greco-Roman world was a dog-eat-dog. Wealthy and well-connected people fought for dominance, hoarded resources, and spurned the poor outcast. In Jerusalem, powerful people oppressed and enslaved poor people. Survival was a daily difficult work. So imagine the relational complexity of new believers from every ethnic and socio-economic strata of Jerusalem, suddenly thrust together in the same worship spaces. The strong and the weak, Jewish and Gentile, rich and poor, successful and failed, bond and free, educated and ignorant, brought together as equals in Jesus. Hierarchies were flattened in the gospel as religion gave way to a new gospel relationships. It was a radical reordering of a society, a cultural phenomenon. Now, let's observe in the book of, I'm going to turn there, in the book of Acts chapter 4, what took place in this new gospel-shaped identity that was going on in this church. So it was the dog-eat-dog world. It was the wealth equals status. The possessions rather equals power. And people looked to you as based on what you had. That's why with Abraham, like, he had many houses, he had many land. Job, he had this many, this and that. And they kind of listed off the camels and the sheep and the herds and the flocks and all of that, right? Because that represented status. But in this world now, it has become the dog-eat-dog world, so to speak, the power grab, if you would. And in verse number 32, the multitude of them that believe were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common. With great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. And this was exciting times. Not only were they preaching the gospel, but they had freedom and great power to do so. They were just preaching the grace of God. And neither was there any among them that lacked. For as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold, and laid them down at the apostles' feet. Distribution was made unto every man according as he had need. And Joseph, who by the apostles was surnamed Barnabas, which is being interpreted the son of consolation, a Levite, and of a country of Cyprus, having land, sold it, brought the money, and laid it at the apostles' feet. So, are you seeing this? Are you catching this? Peter and John at each other's throats the whole time during Jesus' ministry. He taught them over and over again. He sat down with them. He showed them how to heal. He showed them how to love your neighbor as yourself. He showed them how to love God. Like, he gave himself to God. He gave himself for the disciples. And then at the end of it all, he walks, he rises up into heaven, says, hey, I'm going to send you power. The Holy Ghost is coming upon you, and you shall be witnesses unto me. And man, they launched. And the church took off. Peter and John, great boldness, great unity, great confidence in the gospel. It reshaped their identity. Now they are just confident in the gospel and who Jesus is and what he did for them. And it's taking off in the church. The church at Jerusalem now, they are so passionate about the gospel getting out. They are willing to sell the things that they just don't need. They have sitting around. They're selling it, and they're bringing that to the church, basically, so that the church can continue to get the gospel out. That is incredible. And Barnabas himself went and sold his land. He had, it doesn't matter how much he had, but he had land, went and sold it, took in today's terminology, around here looking around for property, if you want an acre, you're looking at least $10,000 for an acre. So in today's world, if somebody sold just 1 acre and brought that in, this church would be like, wow, we can do a lot with 10,000. This little church can. So who knows? But in those days, like just to do that, to get rid, just offloading stuff for the sake of the gospel, that was not what they did. They did not just do that. They hoarded stuff. They gathered as much material wealth as they possibly could. And so it was an awesome thing that was taking place here. The gospel in Luke, as the writer, is not necessarily giving us directives for the 21st century life. In other words, you got to go out and sell everything you have in order for the gospel to go forward. Now, that's a if you can, if the Holy Spirit speaks that to you, then yes. But the idea is that this was a new psyche that materialized from the gospel. Selfish people became selfless. Disagreeable people became of one heart. Greedy people stopped hoarding resources and began to share with those in need. Fearful people began to speak courageously of Jesus. Grace abounded from previously graceless heart. One of the greatest evidence of these new gospel identities was the reordering of material values. In a society where resources were precious, self-centered people became abundance-minded. Hoarders saw their material possessions through a gospel lens. Being given more than enough in Jesus, promised all the resources of heaven, and adopted by an infinite Father, they began to see their immediate supply as expendable and useful. Generous, new desires grew from formerly greedy hearts. Their security went vertical, making their possessions expendable. New believers stopped scrambling in the swirling currents of physical neediness and decided rather to stand in God's provision. Sincere believers voluntarily liquidated their excess possessions, houses, lands, things they didn't need for the sake of the gospel. This was an astounding development in a culture so typically averse to it. Among the great irony was a Grecian Jew and religious leader named Barnabas, nicknamed Encourager. It was unlikely that Barnabas would leave the traditional religious structure to follow a self-proclaimed Messiah who died. It was even more unlikely that a religious leader would sacrifice his material wealth in this traditional culture. Wealth was viewed as God's reward to those most deserving. Hence the Abraham's example, illustration. And a lot of people point to Abraham. There's a lot of wealth there. Solomon, a lot of wealth there. He was blessed by God. When they were blessed by God, material wealth. So they hoarded it. They wanted to look good in the eyes of the others. Imagine the wonder that filtered through the city when Barnabas sold his own land and brought the money to the disciples for the gospel ministry. His heart was pure. His psyche was generous. His vertical value system reordered horizontal priorities. Barnabas wasn't seeking attention, and nobody preached a series on the 7 principles of a financial blessing. He simply stood up and found solid ground under his feet that happened to be more solid than having his accounts and investments in a portfolio. Man, can you imagine if God got a hold of us like that today? Now, He's working. He's moving. He's reshaping still. It may not come out this way, but it does come out in ways that we, maybe not materially, but relationally. Comes out in our emotions. It comes out sometimes in our finances. Comes out in our spirits, in our desires. It just comes out like we no longer are grounded in what I can get. That selfish hoarding of responsibility. No, we're just outward, flowing outward. However, the next verse, chapter 5, verse 1, the first word is but. But a certain man named Ananias, with Sapphira his wife, sold a possession. Hey, we're on the right track, right? They sold a possession. That's what everybody else is doing. We're selling everything we've got, and we're going to bring it to the church so they can get the gospel out. But they kept back part of it. We know the story for the most part. We all know the story. They held back. Just kind of said, okay, I'm going to bring this. What I did, everybody else is doing it. This is what I did. I'm going to bring that. Now, by the way, was it required for them to do this? It wasn't required. There's no like, hey, if you want to be successful in gospel ministry, sell your stuff and bring it to the church. But they did, and then they lied about it. A traditional identity is stoked feverishly in a room full of people who agree on similar behaviors and then mutually affirm each other for performing those behaviors better than those outside of the room. It's a sad game that we're all tempted to play. This is what happened with a man named Ananias and Sapphira. They brought their traditional identities into a gospel environment, attempting to exploit the new church for admiration and self-gratification. Hey, look at me. I'm here. I sold my land and I'm bringing the stuff to the church. Perhaps they, quote-unquote, wanted to keep up with the Barnabases. Rather than stand in the gospel identity, they allowed the pressure of traditional culture to pull them into pretense and fakery. They sold their land voluntarily, but agreed to lie about the amount of money they gave. Though they were free to give all, part, or none of it, they chose to put on a show. It's a shocking story because moments after they publicly lied, they were providentially, quote-unquote, taken out. God took their lives, making a very public statement, and here you go. Do not use my church to construct a weak identity. And how often do we try to do that? I'm doing this. I'm here. And we're just doing it for the show. We want people to see that we're good. And God's saying, no, don't do that. This is a warning that Jesus issued to us. He issued this by sharing this story in the Gospels, or in the story in this particular passage. So this passage describes three things that happened to the new church after this spectacle. First, believers became afraid to fake it. Good thing, right? Pretense, duplicity, and relational insecurities gave way to absolute authenticity. Second, a contingency of wealthy, politically motivated people walked away and refused to join them. So it was filtering them out. Third, purity of motives gave free course for the gospel to change lives, and many new believers were born. God's Spirit was unrestrained. So actually out of this, God filtered through. He was filtering through hey, if you're really truly being duplicitous in this, if you're being fake and pretentious, man, get that right. Don't let that be a part of your psyche, right? Do not use the church or God to build and construct your weak identity. Then there's those that really are after the wealth and they want the status and they want the prestige and wait a minute, what? No, I don't want to have anything to do with this, and they leave. They're out. But by and large, at the end of the day, the purity of the gospel, that really, truly, these folks said, hey, I want to be authentic in Christ, and I want Him to really, truly flow through me in this. How is He going to show Himself through me, His love, His gospel through me? Believers moved out of God's way and let the gospel run free. When the gospel runs free, grace pours forth, life change abounds, and new identities spring up. Hearts, marriages, families, and churches become healthy and flourish. There was a massive contrast between the early followers of Jesus and the traditional religious world of first century Jerusalem. The same contrast remains vivid today in a gospel versus religion comparison. Barnabas was standing on the solid ground of his new identity, genuinely and generously giving of himself to gospel ministry. On the other hand, Ananias and Sapphira were stuck in the fragile, traditional identity and gripped with pride and insecurity, which drove them to lie to God and His church, shortly and abruptly ending their lives. God prevented a steady stream of politics, envy, and judgmentalism from sweeping into his new community of growing gospel identities. Think about our Barnabas. Every time we see him, he's growing and serving in the gospel. His experience set him free from traditional performance-based living and made him free to be his true self, ministering God's grace wherever God placed him. He was comfortable in his own skin, in many diverse environments with differing people. He blessed, encouraged, and befriended. He was uniquely flexible, durable, and relationally mature. From Jerusalem to Antioch to Tarsus, back to Antioch, and then into Turkey on Paul's first missionary journey. He endured great risk, shouldered great responsibility, adapted to new situations, easily shared the spotlight, willingly served in support roles, and encouraged everyone. He recovered Paul and brought him to Antioch to minister. He journeyed with him to Cyprus and modern-day Turkey. He was gospel-shaped, servant, leader, and a grace giver to the end. And even in separation, from Paul, Barnabas was motivated not by competition, but by grace. He desired to redeem and reclaim his nephew John Mark. Though Paul had reasonable doubts, Barnabas was willing to take the risk of restoring John Mark. So in the gospel, our typical surface fears are resolved. Surface anxieties like how to pay bills or provide for our needs are undergirded by God's promise of provision. A gospel identity is free to be relationally and materially generous. This is why Jesus told his followers to consider the flowers and the birds, how God adorns them and cares for them. Jesus calms our fears, resolves our anxieties, and says, hey, stand up. Stand up. The gospel calls us home from failure. The gospel lifts our head in hardship. The gospel gives solid ground in seasons of fear. And that's the end, really, of what we have to share. But I love that he brought out the example of Barnabas. Only because Barnabas was almost that unsung hero in the Apostle Paul's life. God used him really, truly, to kind of like bring him, if you remember the story, I think it's in Acts chapter 10, somewhere in there, 11, somewhere in there. He brought the Apostle Paul in and said, hey, just give him an ear. You know, imagine seeing that guy walk into your doors for the first time. And all the believers really knew of him was he was the guy running in, grabbing people, ripping them out of their homes, and taking them to jail, persecuting them. And in many cases, they were killed as a result. And Barnabas took he took it. He put his name out there on the line. Why? Because the gospel did that. It totally transformed the way he operated. It wasn't about him. He wasn't about to save his face. He wasn't about trying to just put himself out there. Nope. Hey, listen, I've got this land here. I think I'm going to bring that there. Wait, you mean the Apostle Paul needs a little bit of help? Watch y'all listen. Listen up for me. Just give him an ear. You know, if Barnabas had not been that guy, you know, and I know this is hypothetical, what would have happened to the Apostle Paul? Would he have had a foot, a leg to stand on with the church, that early church? But because the gospel absolutely reshaped his identity, he was able to move forward and be a strong part of the gospel moving forward through the Apostle Paul. So, as we finish up, and we're actually slightly early, which is okay, I'm sure. How would we say the gospel identity reshapes hardship in relationships? Does anybody have any feedback on that one? That's one of the first questions that he puts in here. How would you say that the gospel identity reshapes hardship in relationships?
I think the phrase that you used that he's got us, that's, something I think that, like I said earlier, a little slow on the uptake. I've been reading the Bible in Sunday school and church for so many years, but it's just really been recently that I feel like I'm starting to get the whole gospel identity. And in the process of that, I feel more like when I'm under a hardship or something, just chill. I mean, sometimes I tell myself that more than once. And I may have to have, a little meltdown before I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, he's got this. He's got this. But that's, I think, one of the biggest things that comes out of the gospel.
Absolutely.
He's got this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, as far as, relationships, whether it's, internal, external, I know that, it could be, a relationship that you're struggling with at work, the boss, the coworker, whatever, that could be something that you allow the gospel to just totally say, okay, now how does Jesus want this to look like on the backside of it? What coming forward out of this? How is that actually going to, move this relationship in a positive way? If I respond the way I want to respond, will they be softened to the gospel at some point? And that could very well, we know, we've said, we've used the word, you don't want to lose your testimony, right? And this really this gospel identity kind of gives it some more, really just some more foundation, if you would, and that, man, if I respond in this way to my boss or to my coworker, they might turned away from hearing the gospel. Maybe they are believers. Maybe they're just struggling believers, and our response to them just proves, see, that's just how the rest of them are. They're all like that,
I'm struggling with one of my sisters. She thinks that she is the authority,
Sure.
About Christianity, and everybody comes to her, and she knows it all. And so it's like I have recently tried to figure out how, because our relationship is so strained right now. It's like, how do I approach her? Because she already thinks she's way holier and way above me, and
sure,
So how do you approach something like that? So I just started praying about it because I don't know.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I don't know that I can, but
God's got
I'm
this.
patient. God will do it.
Yeah. Right. That's what I love about, even like this Sunday, studying through the Psalm, like waited patiently. Got to wait patiently sometimes, and that's well, who does?
You're the most impatient person I know.
Yeah.
I like to see things get done.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely.
I almost laughed out loud when you're talking about the little boy, like say you have a preschooler doesn't want to go to school or something. My youngest grandson, when he was getting ready to go to kindergarten, he told his mom and dad, I'm not going. And they're like, well, you have to. Well, I'm not going. Well, you're going to have to. Pretty soon he goes, well, I'll tell you what, you make me go, but I'm going to throw a fit.
He said it. He called it.
No, he went, and he come home, and they
Had a
were
good time.
like, so, did you like school? He goes, yeah.
Like, that's the dumbest question you could ask.
What would make you think I wouldn't?
Who was that?
Miles.
Oh, okay.
That's
Okay,
funny.
yes, I was picturing him, but I wasn't sure.
Yes, it was.
There you go.
Funny, because it was like, yeah, he was very emphatic. You make me go, I'll go, but boy, I'm gonna throw a fit.
Try. Try. Very good.
Cracks me up.
Cute.
How about let's see about this next question. How does the gospel identity drive away fear? How does the gospel identity drive away fear? I think, personally just recognizing that Jesus, is the Savior, right? That He is the Lord in my life. Then that gives you a certain amount of confidence, especially if you're trying to share the gospel with somebody. Talking to a guy the other day, one of my coworkers, and it was just everything in me to be like, see, like that's why we don't. But I knew I could just tell I've kind of come away from the conversation that honestly, he needs to know that church is the real deal, and he's a young kid anyway, so the chances of him coming to our church is very slim to none. But I don't want him to, I just get him thinking, right? Sometimes that fear of, well, what are they going to say? What are they going to do? What is that? How's that going to play in this? Can be a big factor but the gospel can give you that confidence in driving that fear away. So
I think that kind of fear with older people coming to the Lord is the harder, because like my dad was always a believer and was a big believer in prayer, but he had every excuse in the book not to go to church. Church is for hypocrites. I'm like, you are so right. Everybody in there is a darn hypocrite, just like me. And you know, then he didn't know how to respond back. But I think one of his biggest fears was that somebody would ask him something and he wouldn't know the answer. Or like, you know, everybody else would understand the story, but he wouldn't. And I think that is what kept him at arm's length for so many years.
Sure.
But he did get baptized, and he did, you know, come to the Lord, and was saved before his death. Wow.
Nice.
And there were some drastic changes the last 2 or 3 months of his life.
That's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing.
Love that.
He's really afraid of being the, you know, if everybody's laughing and he's like, what's funny? You know, like, then you're the joke. Are you laughing at me?
Sure. Yep. And what does fear say about our identity? How about that?
I think kind of the same thing. I mean, you know, when I become real fearful of a situation or something, just having to remind myself, he's got it.
Right.
You put it in his hands and let it go. Because that is the world's hardest thing. Because we want to give it and take it back. Give it and take it back. You know, if he don't fix it quick enough, want to take it back and fix it himself.
Yeah.
Never
Or
works, but-
or if this doesn't happen, then you know, well, we must be doing, you know, something's right, or whatever the case might be. It absolutely. Yep. Very good. All right. Well, I think that's all we have for this. Unless anybody has anything else, we're going to finish up with a word of prayer, and we will be dismissed.